On a sweltering August night in 1987, the fluorescent lights of Metropolitan General Hospital cast harsh shadows across the pediatric ward, creating a maze of brightness and darkness that would forever haunt the memory of those who walked its corridors. The air conditioning wheezed through ancient vents, barely cutting through the oppressive heat that had gripped the city for weeks. In room 314, a young mother named Grace Rodriguez clutched her newborn daughter to her chest, her fingers trembling as she traced the baby's delicate features. The infant, barely 3 weeks old, burned with fever. Her tiny body, no bigger than a loaf of bread, radiated heat that seemed impossible for something so small to contain. Grace had named her Isabella, a name that meant devoted to God, though neither Grace nor her boyfriend Marcus Thompson had been particularly religious. Something about their daughter's arrival had stirred a desperate hope in both of them, a belief that this child might be their salvation from the cycle of poverty and violence that had defined their young lives. Grace was 19, Marcus 21. They lived in the Riverside Projects, where sirens were as common as birdsong and where dreams went to die. But Isabella had changed everything. From the moment she drew her first breath, Grace felt a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. This child would have a different life. This child would escape. Now, as Grace watched her daughter's labored breathing, that fierce protectiveness manifested as raw terror. The fever had spiked to 10 on 4 degrees, and the emergency room doctor, a tired-looking man with kind eyes named Dr. Harrison, had insisted on immediate admission. Isabella had aspirated amniotic fluid during birth, developing a dangerous infection that required round-the-clock monitoring and intravenous antibiotics. "She's going to be fine," Dr. Harrison had assured them, his voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who delivered both miracles and tragedies with equal measure. "We caught it early. The antibiotics will knock this out in a few days." But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the fever or the antiseptic smell that permeated everything, making her feel like she was trapped inside a medicine bottle. It was something else, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, the kind her grandmother used to call the devil walking over your grave. The sensation had started in the emergency room, when a woman in scrubs had approached them. She was heavy-set, probably in her late 20s, with dark skin and an easy smile that seemed genuine. She wore the same light blue uniform as the other nurses, carried herself with the same brisk efficiency, but something about her felt off. "Don't you worry about that baby," the woman had said, placing a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder. "Babies are stronger than they look. The baby don't cry for you, you cry for the baby." The words had struck Grace as odd, but she'd been too frightened and exhausted to process why. Now, as she sat in the dimly lit hospital room, she replayed the encounter in her mind. The woman's badge had been turned around, showing only a blank white backing. Her smile had been warm, but her eyes had been calculating, studying Isabella with an intensity that went beyond professional concern. Marcus had gone home to shower and change clothes, promising to return before dawn. Grace had wanted to go with him. The hospital's industrial bleach scent made her nauseous, and the constant beeping of machines set her teeth on edge. But she couldn't leave Isabella, not even for an hour. The night shift had just begun, bringing with it a different energy. The day nurses, with their efficient routines and constant chatter, had been replaced by a smaller, quieter crew. The hallways grew darker, lit only by emergency lighting and the occasional pool of illumination from a nurse's station. The sounds changed too. Fewer footsteps, more electronic beeps, the distant hum of machinery keeping other people's loved ones alive. At 2:17 a.m., Grace finally succumbed to exhaustion. She'd been awake for 36 hours straight, and her body simply couldn't fight anymore. Her head lolled back against the uncomfortable vinyl chair, and she slipped into a restless sleep filled with dreams of Isabella running through sunlit fields, healthy and laughing. She never saw the figure that slipped into the room 23 minutes later. The woman moved with practiced silence, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the linoleum floor. She'd been watching the ward for 3 weeks, learning the routines, memorizing the shift changes, identifying the blind spots where security cameras couldn't see. She knew that the night nurse would be in room 322 for the next 15 minutes, helping an elderly patient with medication. She knew that the security guard's rounds would take him to the opposite end of the building. She knew that Grace Rodriguez, exhausted from days of worry, would sleep deeply enough that a freight train could pass through the room without waking her. Most importantly, she knew that Isabella Rodriguez was exactly what she'd been searching for. The woman's name was Diana Blackwood, though the identification badge she wore belonged to someone else. A night shift nurse named Patricia Wells, who was currently home with the flu. Diana had spent months preparing for this moment, studying the hospital's layout, befriending staff members, establishing a presence that wouldn't seem out of place. She'd even helped deliver 3 babies in the maternity ward, earning the trust and admiration of the real medical staff. Diana's hands shook slightly as she reached for Isabella. The baby was warm from fever, her tiny chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. The IV line snaked from her arm to a hanging bag of antibiotics. A cruel irony, since the medicine that was meant to save her would now never reach her bloodstream. With surgical precision, Diana disconnected the IV line. The baby stirred but didn't wake. Diana wrapped her in a hospital blanket, tucking the small bundle against her chest beneath her loose-fitting scrub top. To any casual observer, she would appear to be a slightly overweight nurse going about her rounds. Grace murmured in her sleep, but didn't wake. Diana stood frozen for a moment, studying the young mother's face. She looked so young, barely more than a child herself. For a fleeting instant, Diana felt something that might have been guilt, but then Isabella shifted against her chest, and the feeling evaporated. This baby belonged with her. This baby would complete the family she'd been denied by cruel fate, and a body that couldn't carry children to term. Diana had lost 4 babies in the past 5 years. 3 miscarriages and 1 stillbirth had left her hollow, desperate, willing to do anything to fill the aching void where her maternal dreams should have lived. Her husband had left after the stillbirth, unable to cope with her increasing instability. Her family had stopped calling, tired of her obsession with pregnancy and babies. Only Diana's sister Carmen still maintained contact, and even that relationship had grown strained. But tonight would change everything. Tonight, Diana would finally become the mother she was meant to be. She slipped from the room as silently as she'd entered, moving through the hospital corridors with the confidence of someone who belonged. The security guard nodded at her as she passed. They'd spoken several times during her weeks of preparation, and he knew her as Patricia, the dedicated night nurse who often worked double shifts. "How's the Rodriguez baby?" he asked, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. "Fever's breaking," Diana replied without breaking stride. "Dr. Harrison thinks she'll be ready to go home in a day or 2. It was a lie, of course, but one delivered with such casual certainty that the guard never questioned it. Diana continued toward the elevator, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard throughout the building. But her breathing remained steady, her pace unhurried. She'd rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind, and now her body moved on autopilot. The elevator arrived with a soft ding that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the quiet hospital. Diana stepped inside, pressing the button for the parking garage. As the doors closed, she allowed herself a small smile. Isabella stirred against her chest, making tiny mewling sounds that sent warmth flooding through Diana's entire being. "It's okay, sweet girl," she whispered. "Mama's here now. Mama's gonna take care of you." The elevator descended into darkness, carrying Diana and Isabella toward a future that neither of their original lives had prepared them for. Behind them, Grace Rodriguez slept on, unaware that her world had just collapsed around her. The discovery came at 3:47 a.m., when the night nurse finally made her scheduled check on room 314. Nurse Patricia Wells, the real Patricia Wells, who had dragged herself to work despite her flu because they were short-staffed, found Grace still sleeping in the vinyl chair, but the crib was empty. Patricia's first thought was that someone had moved the baby for testing. It happened sometimes with sick infants, emergency blood work or imaging that couldn't wait for morning. But there was no notation on the chart, no authorization slip, no indication that Isabella had been moved at all. Patricia checked the bathroom, thinking perhaps Grace had taken the baby there. Empty. She checked with the nurse's station, thinking maybe another nurse had moved. Isabella without updating the chart. No one had seen the baby or authorized any movement. A cold realization began to settle in Patricia's stomach as she gently shook Grace awake. Mrs. Rodriguez, Mrs. Rodriguez, I need you to wake up. Grace's eyes fluttered open, immediately focusing on the empty crib. The color drained from her face as she processed what she was seeing. Where's Isabella? Her voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might make the nightmare real. I was hoping you could tell me, Patricia said, her training kicking in even as panic began to claw at her chest. When did you last see her? Grace looked at the clock on the wall, her mind struggling to process time. I fell asleep around 2:30. She was right there. She was sleeping. Grace's voice rose with each word, until she was nearly shouting, Where is my baby? Where is my baby? Patricia was already reaching for the red emergency phone that connected directly to hospital security. This was every hospital's worst nightmare. A missing patient, especially an infant. Protocol dictated immediate lockdown, a systematic search of every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. But even as Patricia made the call, even as alarms began to sound throughout the building, she knew they were too late. Someone had taken Isabella Rodriguez, and they had a nearly 2-hour head start. The next few hours passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Security guards raced through corridors, checking every room twice. Police officers arrived, their radios crackling with urgent communications. Hospital administrators appeared, their faces grim with the knowledge that their careers might not survive this scandal. Marcus Thompson burst through the emergency room doors at 4:23 a.m., having been awakened by Grace's hysterical phone call. He found her in an interview room with 2 detectives, a middle-aged woman named Detective Lisa Santos and her partner, a younger man called Detective Jim Morrison. Grace was sobbing uncontrollably, her hands shaking as she tried to remember every detail of the previous evening. Tell me about the nurse, Detective Santos said for the 3rd time, her voice gentle but insistent. The one who spoke to you in the emergency room. She said, babies don't cry for you, you cry for the baby. Grace managed between sobs. It didn't make sense, but she seemed nice. She seemed like she cared. Can you describe her? Heavy set, black, maybe 5'7" or 8. She was wearing scrubs like everyone else. Grace looked up with desperate eyes. Why aren't you out looking for her? Why are you sitting here asking me questions when someone has my baby? Detective Morrison leaned forward. Mrs. Rodriguez, we have every available officer searching the city, but we need to understand what happened here first. Every detail could be important. Marcus spoke for the first time since arriving. What about security cameras? This is a hospital. There have to be cameras everywhere. The detectives exchanged a look that made Grace's blood run cold. The security system experienced a malfunction last night, Detective Santos said carefully. The cameras in this section of the hospital weren't recording between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. The words hit Grace like a physical blow. Someone had planned this. Someone had watched them, studied them, waited for the perfect moment to steal their child. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. It was a calculated abduction. I want to see the footage from before the malfunction, Marcus demanded, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. I want to see this woman. I want to know who took my daughter. We're working on that, Detective Morrison assured him. But right now, we need to establish a timeline. When exactly did each of you last see Isabella? As Grace recounted the evening's events for what felt like the 100th time, Diana Blackwood was already 3 states away, driving through the pre-dawn darkness with Isabella sleeping peacefully in a car seat beside her. The baby's fever had broken during the drive, and she was breathing easier now, her tiny face relaxed in natural sleep. Diana had been planning this moment for months, ever since her last miscarriage had confirmed what her doctors had been telling her for years. She would never carry a child to term. Her body simply wasn't capable of it, but that didn't mean she couldn't be a mother. It just meant she had to be creative about how she acquired her child. She'd chosen the name Rebecca for the baby, after her grandmother, who had raised her when her own mother proved incapable of the task. Rebecca Diana Blackwood. It had a nice ring to it, Diana thought. She'd already prepared all the necessary paperwork, forged birth certificates, and medical records that would establish Rebecca's new identity. She'd rented a small house in a suburb of Denver, far from the chaos she'd left behind in the city. By the time the sun rose, Diana was pulling into the driveway of her new home, a modest 2-bedroom ranch house on a quiet street lined with maple trees. The neighbors were elderly, the kind of people who minded their own business and wouldn't ask too many questions about the single mother who'd moved in with her newborn daughter. Inside the house, Diana had prepared everything a baby could need. A nursery painted in soft yellow, with a white crib and a rocking chair where she could hold Rebecca during midnight feedings. Bottles and formula, diapers and baby clothes in every size up to 12 months. Books about child development, toys designed to stimulate infant brain growth. Everything the experts recommended for raising a healthy, happy child. As Diana carried the sleeping baby into the house, she felt a sense of completion she'd never experienced before. This was her home, her family, her life. The past, including the previous identity of the child in her arms, was irrelevant. What mattered was the future they would build together. She settled into the rocking chair with Rebecca, watching the baby's peaceful face in the morning light that streamed through the nursery windows. Outside, she could hear the sounds of suburban life beginning. Lawn mowers starting up, children riding bicycles, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Normal sounds for a normal life, the kind of life she'd always dreamed of having. Diana began to hum a lullaby her grandmother had sung to her, the same song she'd been humming during those long months of preparing for this moment. Rebecca stirred at the sound, her eyes fluttering open to reveal the dark brown irises she'd inherited from her biological parents. But Diana didn't think of Grace and Marcus. In her mind, those people no longer existed. Rebecca was hers now, and that was all that mattered. 300 miles away, Grace Rodriguez sat in a hospital room that had become a crime scene, staring at the empty crib where her daughter should have been sleeping. The morning light that seemed so hopeful in Diana's new home felt harsh and accusatory here, illuminating the stark reality of what had been lost. Detective Santos had promised they would find Isabella, had assured Grace that infant abductions were rare and usually solved quickly. But as the hours passed with no leads, no sightings, no trace of the mysterious nurse who had vanished with Grace's child, that promise began to feel increasingly hollow. The hospital had been searched 3 times. Every employee had been questioned. The security footage from before the malfunction had been analyzed frame by frame. But the woman Grace described didn't appear on any of it. It was as if she had materialized out of thin air, taken Isabella, and disappeared back into the void. By noon, the story had broken on local news. Isabella's photo, taken during her brief stay in the hospital, appeared on television screens across the city. The image showed a tiny, perfect face, eyes closed in sleep, completely unaware that she was about to become the center of a tragedy that would haunt everyone involved for decades to come. Grace couldn't look at the photo without breaking down. Each time Isabella's face appeared on screen, it felt like losing her all over again. Marcus had stopped talking altogether, sitting in stony silence as he stared at the television coverage of their nightmare. "We'll find her," Detective Santos said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Whoever did this made mistakes. They always do. And when they do, we'll be there. But even as she spoke the words, Detective Santos knew they were dealing with something unprecedented. The woman who had taken Isabella had planned this meticulously, had studied the hospital's routines and security systems, had somehow managed to disable the cameras at exactly the right moment. This wasn't the work of someone acting on impulse. This was someone who had been planning for a long time, someone who had anticipated every possible obstacle. As the first day of Isabella's disappearance drew to a close, Grace made a promise to herself and to her missing daughter. She would never stop looking. She would never stop believing that Isabella was alive somewhere, and somehow, someday, she would bring her daughter home. She had no way of knowing that Isabella, now Rebecca, was settling into her new life 3 states away, being fed and bathed and sung to by a woman who believed with absolute certainty that she was saving this child from a life of poverty and neglect. Diana Blackwood had convinced herself that she was the answer to every prayer Isabella would ever have, the mother she was always meant to be. The truth, as it often does, lay somewhere between these two realities. But it would be 23 years before that truth finally came to light, and by then, the damage would be irreversible for everyone involved. As night fell on that August day in 1987, 2 mothers tucked the same child into bed. One sang lullabies in a perfect nursery, convinced she was providing the love and security every child deserved. The other sat in an empty room, clutching a hospital blanket that still smelled like her daughter, praying to a God she wasn't sure existed that somewhere, Isabella was safe and would someday find her way home. Neither of them could have imagined the chain of events they had just set in motion, or the way this single night would reshape the lives of everyone it touched. The theft of Isabella Rodriguez would become more than just a crime. It would become a puzzle that would take decades to solve, and its resolution would challenge everything everyone involved thought they knew about justice, forgiveness, and the true meaning of family. But that reckoning was still years away. For now, there was only the darkness, the uncertainty, and the beginning of a mystery that would haunt a city for a generation. 20 years had passed since that August night, but Grace Rodriguez still woke every morning with the same crushing weight in her chest. The empty feeling that had settled there the moment she discovered Isabella's crib vacant had never lifted. Not even for a day. Now 39 years old, Grace worked as a medical records clerk at a clinic across town from Metropolitan General. She could never bring herself to set foot in that hospital again, though it haunted her dreams with clockwork regularity. The apartment she shared with her mother in the Riverside projects had become a shrine to Isabella. The walls were covered with age-progressed photos created by forensic artists, showing what Isabella might look like at 5, 10, 15, 20. Each birthday brought a new photo, a new wave of hope and despair that crashed over Grace with devastating force. The latest showed a young woman with Grace's eyes and Marcus's strong jawline. But it was just another ghost image, another reminder of everything that had been stolen from her. Marcus had left the city 3 years after the kidnapping. Unable to bear the constant reminders of their lost daughter, he'd remarried, had 2 more children, and rarely spoke to Grace anymore, except for the annual phone call on Isabella's birthday. Those conversations had become exercises in mutual torture, 2 people picking at wounds that had never healed, offering each other comfort they couldn't provide themselves. Detective Santos had retired 5 years earlier, but not before ensuring Isabella's case remained active. Her successor, Detective Ray Martinez, was younger, more tech-savvy, but he carried the same haunted expression that came with working cold cases involving missing children. He'd made it his personal mission to solve the Rodriguez case, spending countless off-duty hours reviewing evidence, following up on leads that inevitably led nowhere. The investigation had gone through phases over the years. Initially, there had been numerous sightings, a baby matching Isabella's description spotted in shopping malls from California to Florida. Each report had been investigated thoroughly, but none had yielded results. DNA testing had ruled out dozens of children whose well-meaning guardians had reported them as possible matches. As the years passed, the case had evolved from active investigation to cold case status, though it never truly went cold in the hearts of those involved. Grace received updates quarterly, usually disappointing reports about leads that had dried up or new technologies that hadn't yet yielded breakthroughs. But she never stopped believing that Isabella was alive somewhere, living under another name, unaware of the family that had never stopped searching for her. 3 states away, Rebecca Blackwood was experiencing her own crisis of identity, though she didn't yet understand its connection to the Rodriguez family's ongoing nightmare. At 20 years old, she was a junior at the University of Colorado, studying photography with dreams of becoming a documentary filmmaker. She had her mother Diana's determination but possessed an artistic sensibility that seemed to come from nowhere. Diana could identify. Rebecca had always felt slightly displaced, as if she were living someone else's life. The feeling had started in childhood, small inconsistencies that she couldn't quite articulate. Diana would tell stories about Rebecca's birth and early years, but the details never quite aligned. There were no baby photos from the first few months of Rebecca's life, which Diana explained by claiming their house had been burglarized when Rebecca was 6 months old, with all the early photos stolen along with other valuables. There were other things too. Rebecca's birth certificate looked different from those of her friends, with a slightly different typeface and paper quality that made her wonder if it was a replacement copy. Diana couldn't produce any hospital records from Rebecca's birth, claiming the small private clinic where she'd delivered had closed years ago and lost its records in a fire. When Rebecca had needed her birth certificate to apply for a passport in high school, Diana had become unusually agitated, insisting they could vacation in Mexico instead of Europe. Most troubling were Rebecca's own memories, or lack thereof. She had vivid recollections going back to age 4 or 5, but everything before that was a complete blank. Her earliest memory was of sitting in Diana's lap in their small house in Denver, but it felt more like the beginning of her life than just the beginning of her memory. It was as if she had materialized fully formed at age 4, with no past beyond that moment. Diana had always been evasive about Rebecca's father. The story changed depending on when Rebecca asked. Sometimes he was a soldier who died overseas, sometimes a college boyfriend who left when he learned about the pregnancy, sometimes a married man who couldn't acknowledge his daughter. Rebecca had stopped asking by the time she reached high school, tired of the inconsistencies and Diana's obvious discomfort with the subject. The relationship between Rebecca and Diana had grown increasingly strained as Rebecca entered adulthood. Diana had always been protective to the point of paranoia, reluctant to let Rebecca participate in school activities that might require background checks or official documentation. She'd homeschooled Rebecca until high school, claiming it would provide a better education, but Rebecca suspected it had more to do with avoiding scrutiny from school officials. Diana had aged poorly over the years, the stress of maintaining her deception taking a visible toll. She'd never remarried, never formed close friendships, never established roots in any community. They'd moved 3 times during Rebecca's childhood, always for reasons that seemed vague and unnecessary. Each move had felt like running from something, though Diana could never articulate what they were fleeing. Now, as Rebecca sat in her dorm room working on a photography project about identity and family, she found herself staring at a photo she'd taken of Diana the previous Christmas. Her mother's face was etched with lines of worry and guilt, her eyes holding secrets that Rebecca was only beginning to understand she needed to uncover. The breaking point came during Rebecca's spring break in 2007. She'd returned home to Denver for the week, planning to spend time with Diana and work on her senior portfolio. Instead, she found herself having the same circular conversations about her past, growing increasingly frustrated with her mother's evasions. "I need my original birth certificate," Rebecca announced over dinner on Tuesday night. "Not a copy, the original. I'm applying for a fellowship that requires original documentation." Diana's fork clattered against her plate, and she went pale. "Why do you need the original?" The copy has always been fine for everything else. Because this is different. It's a fellowship to study documentary photography in Europe, and they require original documents for the visa application. I can't use copies. Maybe you should consider a different fellowship. Something domestic. Rebecca stared at her mother, feeling a familiar surge of frustration. Why are you always trying to keep me from going anywhere? Why do you act like the world outside Denver is going to swallow me whole? I'm not trying to keep you from anything. I just think... You just think what? That I should stay here forever. Never explore, never discover anything about myself or the world. Rebecca's voice was rising. 20 years of suppressed questions finally demanding answers. Why can't you just get me the original birth certificate? Where is it? Diana stood abruptly, beginning to clear the dishes though they'd barely finished eating. I'll see what I can do. Maybe I can request another original from the state. Another original? That doesn't make sense, Mom. There's only one original. You know what I mean. But Rebecca didn't know what she meant, and the conversation left her with more questions than answers. That night, she lay awake in her childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the gnawing feeling that her entire life was built on lies. The next morning, while Diana was at work, Rebecca decided to search the house. She'd never done anything like it before. Diana had always respected her privacy, and Rebecca had returned the favor. But the conversation about the birth certificate had triggered something. A desperate need to understand why her mother seemed so terrified of official documentation. She started with Diana's bedroom, feeling guilty but determined. The dresser drawers yielded nothing unusual. Clothing, jewelry, financial documents that all seemed normal. The closet was similarly unremarkable until Rebecca noticed a small fireproof safe tucked behind a stack of old photo albums. The safe was locked, but Rebecca remembered Diana writing down the combination years earlier, joking that she was getting too old to remember numbers. She found the slip of paper taped inside Diana's jewelry box, and with trembling fingers, she opened the safe. Inside were documents that made Rebecca's blood run cold. There was a birth certificate for Rebecca Diana Blackwood, but it looked different from the copy she'd always known. The paper was wrong, the typing slightly off. There were also documents for several other identities: Patricia Wells, Susan Morrison, Jennifer Adams. Each had accompanying driver's licenses and social security cards, all with Diana's photo but different names and birth dates. At the bottom of the safe, wrapped in a plastic bag, was a newspaper clipping from August 1987. The headline read, "Infant abducted from Metropolitan General Hospital." Below it was a photo of a couple she'd never seen before, a young Hispanic woman and an African-American man, both crying. The woman was holding a small hospital blanket, and the man had his arm around her shoulders. The article described the kidnapping of Isabella Rodriguez, 3 weeks old, taken from her hospital room by someone posing as a nurse. As Rebecca read the details, a memory surfaced from somewhere deep in her subconscious, being very warm, feeling sick, hearing voices that seemed familiar but weren't quite right. Her hands shaking, Rebecca looked at the photo accompanying the article. It showed baby Isabella Rodriguez, taken during her brief hospital stay. The face was tiny, indistinct in the black and white newspaper photo, but something about it made Rebecca's chest tighten with recognition. She pulled out her phone and called her friend Sarah, a graphic design major who had access to photo enhancement software. "I need a favor," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sending you a photo and I need you to enhance it as much as possible. Make it as clear as you can." While she waited for Sarah's response, Rebecca continued searching the safe. At the very bottom was a small plastic hospital bracelet, the kind given to newborn babies. It was faded but still legible. Baby Rodriguez, D.O.B. July 15, 1987. Rebecca's supposed birthday, according to the birth certificate she'd always known, was July 20th, 1987. 5 days later than the bracelet indicated. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Enhanced photo attached. "Girl, where did you get this antique?" The quality was terrible, but I did what I could. Rebecca opened the enhanced image with trembling fingers. The baby's face was clearer now, the features more defined. She pulled up a photo of herself as a newborn, one of the few early photos Diana had claimed survived the burglary, and held it next to the enhanced newspaper image. The faces were identical. Rebecca sank to the floor of Diana's bedroom, the newspaper clipping still clutched in her hand. Everything she'd ever believed about her life, her identity, her family, was a lie. The woman she'd called mother for 20 years was her kidnapper. Her real parents were strangers whose lives had been destroyed by Diana's crime. She thought about all the times Diana had seemed nervous around police officers, all the moves that had never made sense, all the evasions about her past. Diana hadn't been protecting Rebecca from the world. She'd been protecting herself from the consequences of what she'd done. Rebecca's first instinct was to confront Diana immediately, to demand the truth. But a cooler part of her mind recognized the danger in that approach. Diana had already committed one desperate act when she couldn't have children naturally. What might she do if she realized her secret was discovered? Instead, Rebecca carefully replaced everything in the safe exactly as she'd found it, memorizing the combination and the contents. She pocketed the hospital bracelet. It was small enough that Diana wouldn't notice its absence immediately. Then she returned to her dorm room and began researching the Isabella Rodriguez case online. What she found broke her heart. 20 years of searching, of age-progressed photos, of a mother who had never given up hope. Grace Rodriguez, her real mother, still lived in the same city, still worked tirelessly to keep Isabella's case in the public eye. Marcus Thompson, her real father, had moved away, but still participated in anniversary appeals for information. There were websites dedicated to finding Isabella, forums where people discussed theories about what had happened to her. Some thought she was dead, killed shortly after the kidnapping. Others believed she was living somewhere with no knowledge of her true identity. Reading the posts from people who had followed the case for decades, Rebecca felt the weight of their collective grief and hope. She found video interviews with Grace from various anniversary dates over the years. In each one, Grace looked older, more tired, but she never wavered in her belief that Isabella was alive. "I know my daughter is out there somewhere," Grace said in a 2005 interview. "I know she's grown up into a beautiful young woman, and I know that someday, somehow, she'll find her way home to us." Rebecca cried as she watched those videos, mourning not just for the family she'd been stolen from, but for the woman who had raised her. Because despite everything, despite the lies and the kidnapping and the destruction Diana had caused, Rebecca still loved her. Diana had been a good mother in many ways, attentive, supportive, loving. The fact that she was also a criminal didn't erase 20 years of care and devotion, but it also didn't excuse what she'd done. Rebecca spent the next 3 days researching, planning, trying to figure out the right way to handle the most complicated situation of her life. She couldn't just call the police, not without giving Diana a chance to explain, to prepare for what was coming. Despite everything, she owed her that much. She also couldn't just call Grace and Marcus and announce that she was their daughter. They'd been through 20 years of false hopes and dead ends. She needed to be absolutely certain before putting them through that emotional roller coaster again. The answer came to her in the form of DNA testing. She could submit a sample to one of the genealogy databases and see if any matches came back. If Isabella Rodriguez was really her, there might be family members who had also submitted samples, looking for connections. But even as she made plans for testing, Rebecca knew the truth in her bones. She was Isabella Rodriguez. She was the baby who had been stolen from Metropolitan General Hospital 20 years ago. She was the daughter Grace Rodriguez still cried for every night, the child Marcus Thompson saw in his dreams. And she was also Rebecca Blackwood, the young woman Diana had raised with love and lies in equal measure. The question now was, what to do with that knowledge? Detective Martinez was having his weekly review of cold cases when the email arrived. It came through the department's tip line, flagged as potentially related to the Rodriguez case. He'd seen hundreds of similar messages over the years. People who thought they might be Isabella, parents who believed their adopted children matched the description, well-meaning citizens who'd spotted someone who resembled the age-progressed photos. But this email was different. It was carefully written, detailed, and included information that hadn't been released to the public. Detective Martinez, it read, "My name is Rebecca Blackwood, and I believe I may be Isabella Rodriguez. I was born on July 15, 1987, and raised by a woman named Diana Blackwood in Denver, Colorado. I have recently discovered evidence that suggests Diana may not be my biological mother, and that my identity may have been falsified. I have a hospital bracelet with the name Baby Rodriguez and a birth date that matches Isabella's case. I am willing to submit to DNA testing, but I wanted to contact you first to discuss the best way to proceed. I understand this is a serious matter, and that my family has suffered greatly. I don't want to cause additional pain if I'm wrong, but I also can't ignore the evidence I've found. Please contact me at your earliest convenience." Martinez read the email 3 times before reaching for his phone to call Grace Rodriguez. This was either the breakthrough they'd been waiting for 20 years to receive, or it was going to be the most devastating false hope yet. Grace answered on the second ring. "Detective Martinez, is there news?" Her voice still carried the same desperate hope it had held for 2 decades, and Martinez felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Grace had trusted him to find her daughter, had believed in him when she'd stopped believing in almost everything else. "Grace, I need you to sit down. I just received a very interesting email about Isabella's case." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When Grace finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "What kind of email?" "A young woman named Rebecca Blackwood believes she may be Isabella. She has compelling evidence, including a hospital bracelet that matches our case details. She's requesting DNA testing." Grace made a sound that might have been a sob or a gasp. "How many times have we been through this, Ray? How many false hopes?" "This feels different, Grace. The details she knows, the evidence she describes. It's not information that's been made public, and the timeline matches perfectly." "I can't do this again," Grace whispered. "I can't get my hopes up just to have them crushed. I'm too old, too tired, too broken." Martinez understood her reluctance. 20 years of disappointment had taken their toll, and Grace had learned to protect herself by expecting the worst. But something about Rebecca Blackwood's email felt genuine in a way that previous leads hadn't. "What if we proceed carefully?" he suggested. "DNA testing first, before any contact. If it's not a match, you never have to know the details. But if it is, then my daughter has been alive all this time, living with the woman who stole her from me." Grace's voice hardened with an anger that had been simmering for 20 years. "If it is, then I've missed watching her grow up, missed her first steps, her first words, her graduation, everything." "Grace, no, you're right. We have to test. We have to know. Because if there's even a chance that Isabella's alive, that she's finally reaching out." Grace took a shuddering breath. "When can we do the testing?" "I'll contact Rebecca Blackwood today and arrange for her to submit a sample to the state lab. We'll use the samples we have on file from you and Marcus for comparison. It should take about a week to get results." After hanging up with Grace, Martinez immediately called the number Rebecca had provided. She answered quickly, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "Ms. Blackwood, this is Detective Martinez with the Metropolitan Police Department. I received your email about the Isabella Rodriguez case. Thank you for calling so quickly." Rebecca's voice was steady, but Martinez could hear the underlying tension. "I know this must sound crazy, but I've found evidence that suggests my entire identity might be false." "I'd like to hear about that evidence." But first, I need to ask you some questions that only Isabella Rodriguez would know. I understand. What was the name of the hospital where you were supposedly born? According to my birth certificate, it was St. Mary's Community Hospital. But I've discovered that hospital doesn't exist and never has. Martinez felt his pulse quicken. That detail had never been released to the public. The fact that Diana had falsified documents mentioning a non-existent hospital. Where did you grow up? Denver, but we moved around a lot. Always within Colorado, but Diana, the woman who raised me, always seemed nervous about staying in one place too long. What made you start questioning your identity? Rebecca told him about the inconsistencies she'd noticed over the years. The missing documentation, Diana's evasiveness about her past. Then she described finding the safe and its contents. Detective Martinez, I know this sounds impossible. I know 20 years is a long time, and I know how many false leads you must have investigated. But I have a hospital bracelet with Isabella's name on it. I have newspaper clippings about her disappearance, and I have baby photos that match the enhanced image from the newspaper. Martinez was taking notes furiously. Ms. Blackwood, I need to ask you about a birthmark. Isabella Rodriguez had a distinctive birthmark. I can't tell you where it was located, but if you are Isabella, you would know. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. There's a small strawberry-shaped mark on my right shoulder blade. Diana always said it was just a random birthmark, but it's very distinctive. Martinez set down his pen and stared at his notes. The birthmark had never been mentioned in any public information about the case. Only Isabella's parents and the investigating officers knew about its exact location and shape. Ms. Blackwood, I think we need to proceed with DNA testing immediately. Can you come to Colorado Springs tomorrow? I'll drive down tonight. After arranging the details for the DNA collection, Martinez sat in his office, staring at Isabella Rodriguez's case file. If Rebecca Blackwood was really Isabella, it would be the resolution of the longest-running abduction case in the department's history. But it would also mean that Diana Blackwood, whoever she really was, had successfully hidden in plain sight for 20 years, while raising a stolen child. The investigation that followed would be massive, complex, and deeply painful for everyone involved. But for the first time in his career, Martinez felt truly hopeful about bringing Isabella Rodriguez home to her family. He picked up the phone to call Grace again. She deserved to know that tomorrow might change everything. 3 states away, Rebecca was packing a bag for the drive to Colorado Springs, her hands shaking as she folded clothes and gathered the evidence she'd found. In a few hours, she would know for certain whether her entire life had been built on a lie. And in a small house in Denver, Diana Blackwood was beginning to realize that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse. Rebecca had been acting strangely since her visit home, asking pointed questions and seeming distant. Diana had noticed the slight disarray in her bedroom, the way her jewelry box had been moved just slightly out of position. Deep down, Diana had always known this day would come. She'd known that eventually Rebecca would start asking questions that couldn't be answered with lies. She'd hoped for more time, prayed that Rebecca would accept the fabricated story of her origins and never dig deeper. But as she sat in her living room that evening, surrounded by 20 years of memories with the daughter she'd stolen, Diana knew that her time as Rebecca's mother was coming to an end. The only question now was whether she would face the consequences with dignity, or whether the desperation that had driven her to kidnap a baby would consume her once again. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over Denver, promising the kind of violent spring thunderstorm that could change the landscape overnight. It seemed fitting, Diana thought, as she picked up the phone to call her sister Carmen. She would need help with what was coming, and she would need someone to understand why she'd done what she'd done. The stolen child was about to become Isabella Rodriguez again, and nothing would ever be the same for any of them. The DNA results arrived on a gray Thursday morning in May, delivered to Detective Martinez's desk in a manila envelope that looked utterly mundane for something that would shatter and rebuild multiple lives. Martinez had been a cop for 15 years, had delivered news of deaths and solved cases that had haunted families for decades, but his hands still trembled as he opened the envelope. The report was clinical, scientific, definitive. Probability of maternity 99.97%. The tested individual shares genetic markers consistent with being the biological child of Grace Rodriguez and Marcus Thompson. Rebecca Blackwood was Isabella Rodriguez. Martinez sat in his office for several minutes, staring at the paper that confirmed what his instincts had told him from the moment he'd read Rebecca's email. 20 years of searching had finally come to an end, but he knew that in many ways the hardest part was just beginning. He called Grace first. She answered before the second ring, as she had every day for the past week. "The results are in," Martinez said without preamble. Grace had been through enough uncertainty. She deserved the truth immediately, clearly, without sugarcoating. The silence stretched so long that Martinez wondered if the call had dropped. Then he heard a sound that might have been sobbing or might have been laughter. "She's alive," Grace whispered finally. "My baby is alive." "She's alive, Grace, and she wants to meet you." This time Grace definitely sobbed. 20 years of grief and hope finally finding release. "When?" she managed. "When can I see her?" "Rebecca is driving up from Denver this afternoon. She'd like to meet you tomorrow if you're ready." "Ready?" Grace laughed through her tears. "I've been ready for 20 years. After coordinating the details with Grace, Martinez called Marcus in Phoenix. The conversation was shorter, more controlled, but Martinez could hear the emotion in Marcus's voice when he said he would fly in immediately. "Detective," Marcus said before hanging up. "What about the woman who took her?" "Diana Blackwood. We'll be issuing an arrest warrant this afternoon. Federal kidnapping charges. She won't be able to run this time." But even as Martinez spoke the words, he knew that apprehending Diana Blackwood would be more complicated than it seemed. She'd evaded detection for 20 years, had created multiple false identities, had proven herself capable of extraordinary deception. The woman who had walked out of Metropolitan General Hospital with baby Isabella had been planning and patient. She wouldn't go quietly. Rebecca drove through the Colorado countryside in a daze. The DNA results folded in her purse like a passport to a new identity. The landscape blurred past her car windows, rolling hills, distant mountains, small towns that looked like postcards. She was driving toward a reunion that should have been joyful, but all she felt was a crushing weight of complexity. She was Isabella Rodriguez. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable. Everything she'd suspected was true. Diana had stolen her, had built an entire life around that theft, had raised her with love that was genuine but founded on an unforgivable crime. As she drove, Rebecca tried to process the magnitude of what lay ahead. Tomorrow she would meet her biological parents, people who had spent 20 years grieving for her. She would look into the faces of strangers who were supposed to be the most important people in her world. She would try to bridge a gap that had been 20 years in the making. But tonight, she had to face Diana. Rebecca pulled into her childhood driveway just as the sun was setting behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of the countless evenings she'd spent in this same spot, coming home from school or friends' houses to the woman she'd called mother. The small ranch house looked exactly the same, but Rebecca felt like she was seeing it through different eyes. Diana's car was in the driveway, which meant she was home from work. Rebecca sat in her car for several minutes, trying to find the courage to walk through that front door and confront the woman who had defined her entire existence. When she finally entered the house, she found Diana in the kitchen preparing dinner as she had thousands of times before. Diana looked up with a smile that faltered when she saw Rebecca's expression. "You're back early," Diana said, her voice carefully neutral. "I thought you weren't coming home until next week." "We need to talk," Rebecca said. Diana set down the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir pasta sauce. Her hands were steady, but Rebecca could see the fear in her eyes. "About what?" Rebecca reached into her purse and pulled out the DNA test results, placing them on the kitchen counter between them. Diana stared at the papers for a long moment before looking up to meet Rebecca's eyes. "So you know," Diana said quietly, "I know you kidnapped me. I know my real name is Isabella Rodriguez. I know my real parents have been searching for me for 20 years. Rebecca's voice was steady, but tears were streaming down her cheeks. "What I don't know is why. Why did you take me? Why did you steal someone's child?" Diana moved to the kitchen table and sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of her 51 years. "I was desperate," she said finally. "I'd lost 4 babies, 4 pregnancies that ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. The doctors said I'd never carry a child to term. My husband left me. I was alone, and I was broken. And I was so angry at God for denying me the one thing I wanted most in the world." "So you stole someone else's baby? I saw you in that hospital, sick and tiny, and your parents looked so young, barely more than children themselves. They lived in the projects, had no money, no resources. I convinced myself that I could give you a better life, that I was saving you from poverty and neglect." Diana's voice broke. "I know how it sounds now. I know it was wrong. But at the time it felt like destiny. Like God was finally answering my prayers." Rebecca sat across from Diana, studying the face she'd known and loved for 20 years. "Did you ever think about them? About Grace and Marcus? About what you put them through?" Diana was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks unchecked. "Every day, every single day for 20 years. But what was I supposed to do? Give you back when you were 5 and didn't remember them? When you were 10 and I was the only mother you'd ever known? When you were 15 and calling me mom and trusting me with your secrets? You were supposed to never take me in the first place." The words hung in the air between them, carrying 20 years of lies and love and complicated Rebecca looked around the kitchen where Diana had taught her to cook, where they'd done homework together, where Diana had bandaged scraped knees and celebrated report cards and listened to teenage heartbreak. "I love you," Diana whispered. "I know I have no right to say that. I know I'm not really your mother, but I love you more than my own life. These 20 years with you have been the happiest of my existence. You are my daughter in every way that matters except biology." Diana nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "What happens now? The police are coming for you. Detective Martinez is issuing an arrest warrant today." They sat in silence for several minutes, 2 women who loved each other despite the terrible circumstances that had brought them together. Finally, Diana spoke again. "Will you visit me? After they arrest me, when this all comes out in the news, when everyone knows what I did, will you still be my daughter?" Rebecca reached across the table and took Diana's hand. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I love you too, but I can't pretend this didn't happen. I can't pretend that 20 years of lies don't matter. I need time to figure out who I am now, and where you fit in that." Diana squeezed Rebecca's hand. "That's fair. That's more than I deserve. I should go," Rebecca said, standing up. "I'm meeting Grace and Marcus tomorrow." "Tell them," Diana started, then stopped. "No, there's nothing I can say that would make any difference. Just be happy, Rebecca. Or Isabella. Whoever you choose to be. Be happy." Rebecca kissed Diana's forehead, breathing in the familiar scent of vanilla perfume and cooking spices that had defined comfort for her entire conscious life. "I'll try," she whispered. As she drove away from the house where she'd grown up, Rebecca saw police cars approaching in her rear-view mirror. Diana would be arrested within the hour, and the news would break by morning. The quiet life they'd built in Denver was about to explode into national headlines. But Rebecca was no longer thinking about Diana or the media circus that was coming. She was thinking about tomorrow, about walking into a room where 2 strangers would look at her and see the daughter they'd lost 20 years ago. She was thinking about the weight of their expectations, their grief, their desperate hope for a reunion that could never really erase the decades they'd lost. Grace Rodriguez stood in front of her bathroom mirror at 5 a.m., trying to decide what a mother should wear to meet the daughter who'd been stolen from her 20 years ago. She'd been awake since 3 a.m., her mind racing through scenarios, conversations, possibilities. Nothing in her life had prepared her for this moment. She'd called in sick to work, though she knew she wouldn't have been able to concentrate anyway. Marcus's flight would arrive at noon, and they'd agreed to meet Rebecca. She still couldn't think of her as Isabella, not yet. At 2 p.m. in Detective Martinez's office, neutral ground, professional setting, with someone trained to handle emotional situations if things went badly. Grace had imagined this reunion countless times over the years, but none of her fantasies had included the complexity of the real situation. In her dreams, Isabella had always been a child who remembered her, who ran into her arms and cried "Mama" and erased 20 years of pain with a single embrace. The reality was that Isabella was now a grown woman who had lived an entire life with another mother, who might look at Grace and see nothing but a stranger. At 11:30 a.m., Grace's phone rang. It was Marcus, calling from the airport. "Grace, have you seen the news?" She hadn't. She'd been too nervous to turn on the television, too afraid that media coverage might somehow jinx the reunion she'd waited decades for. Diana Blackwood was arrested last night. It's all over the national news. CNN, Fox, everyone. They're calling it the longest-running abduction case in American history. Grace felt her stomach drop. She'd known this was coming, but somehow she'd hoped for more time before the world learned about Isabella's return. "Is Rebecca okay? Is she safe?" "I don't know." Martinez isn't answering his phone. "But Grace, there are reporters camped outside the police station. This isn't going to be the quiet reunion we planned." Grace closed her eyes, feeling 20 years of protective instincts surge through her. Isabella had been through enough trauma without having to face a media circus on the day she met her biological parents. "We'll figure it out," Grace said. "We'll protect her, just like we should have 20 years ago." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Grace, what if she doesn't want to see us? What if this is too much for her?" It was the fear that had been haunting Grace since Martinez first called with the news. What if Isabella, Rebecca, looked at them and felt nothing? What if 20 years with Diana Blackwood had made her incapable of connecting with the parents she'd never known? "Then we'll respect that," Grace said, though the words felt like glass in her throat. "We'll love her enough to let her choose." Rebecca arrived at the police station to find it surrounded by news vans and reporters. She sat in her car for several minutes, watching journalists set up cameras and adjust microphones, preparing to broadcast her story to the world. The magnitude of what was happening finally hit her. This wasn't just a personal reunion. It was a national news event. She was about to become the face of the longest-running kidnapping case in American history. Detective Martinez appeared at her car window, offering her a way to enter the building through a back entrance that would avoid the media gauntlet. As they walked through the corridors of the police station, Martinez briefed her on what to expect. "Your parents are nervous," he said. "They've been waiting for this moment for 20 years, but they're also terrified of overwhelming you. Grace, especially, has been very concerned about pressuring you or expecting too much too soon." "What should I call them?" Rebecca asked. "I can't call them Mom and Dad. Diana was. I don't know what Diana is to me now, but I can't just transfer those names to people I've never met. Call them Grace and Marcus for now. See how it feels. Everything else can develop naturally." They paused outside the conference room, where Grace and Marcus were waiting. Rebecca could hear voices inside. Quiet, nervous conversation that stopped abruptly when Martinez knocked. "Ready?" he asked. Rebecca nodded, though she felt anything but ready. Martinez opened the door, and Rebecca got her first look at her biological parents. Grace was smaller than she'd expected, with graying hair and eyes that held 20 years of sadness. But when those eyes met Rebecca's, They lit up with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. Marcus was taller, with kind features and the same bone structure Rebecca saw in her own face when she looked in the mirror. For several seconds, none of them moved. They simply stared at each other, trying to process the magnitude of the moment. Grace spoke first. "You're so beautiful," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You look just like I imagined you would." Rebecca felt tears starting, though she wasn't sure if they were tears of joy or grief, or something more complicated.
You look like the woman in my dreams,"
she said. "I used to have dreams about a woman who looked like you, singing to me. I never understood where they came from." Grace gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth. "I sang to you every night when you were little, lullabies in Spanish that my mother taught me." The connection was immediate and undeniable, but it was also heartbreaking, because for every memory that linked them, there were thousands that didn't exist. 20 years of birthdays, holidays, milestones, and ordinary moments that could never be recovered. Marcus stepped forward cautiously. Would it be okay if I hugged you?" Rebecca nodded and found herself enveloped in an embrace that felt both foreign and familiar. Marcus was crying openly, and she could feel his tears on her shoulder. "I never stopped believing," he whispered. "I never stopped looking for you." They spent the next 2 hours in that conference room, sharing stories and photos, trying to bridge 2 decades of separation with words and tears and careful touches. Grace showed Rebecca baby pictures she'd never seen, told her about the day she was born, described the tiny fingers and toes that had been Diana's first sight. Marcus talked about the college fund he'd maintained for 20 years, the room in his house that he'd kept ready for Isabella's return. Rebecca told them about her life as Rebecca Blackwood, about growing up in Denver, about her love of photography and her dreams of documentary filmmaking. She showed them pictures from her phone, her college graduation, trips with friends, moments from a life they'd never been part of. The conversation was punctuated by long silences, moments when the weight of their lost years became too heavy for words. But gradually, tentatively, they began to build connections. Grace and Rebecca discovered they both loved the same obscure poets. Marcus and Rebecca shared a tendency to organize things by color that made them both laugh. But the reunion was also complicated by the presence of Diana's ghost in the room. Rebecca found herself defending the woman who had raised her, explaining that despite the kidnapping, Diana had been a loving, attentive mother. Grace and Marcus struggled to process this information, caught between gratitude that their daughter had been well cared for and rage at the woman who had stolen her. "She gave me a good life," Rebecca said finally. "I know what she did was unforgivable, but she loved me. She really, truly loved me." Grace was quiet for a long moment. "I'm glad," she said finally, though the words clearly cost her something. "I'm glad you were loved, even if it wasn't by us." As the afternoon wore on, they began to discuss the future. Rebecca would need to decide whether to legally change her name back to Isabella Rodriguez. She would need to figure out her relationship with both sets of families, Grace and Marcus, but also Diana's sister Carmen and the extended network of people who had known her as Rebecca Blackwood. Most immediately, she would need to navigate the media attention that was already swirling around their story. The reunification of Isabella Rodriguez had become national news, and everyone wanted interviews, exclusive access, behind-the-scenes details of their emotional reunion. "I don't want to be famous for this," Rebecca said. "I don't want to be the poster child for kidnapping cases. I just want to figure out who I am now." "Then, that's what we'll do," Grace said firmly. "We'll protect your privacy. We'll deal with the media. We'll do whatever you need us to do." It was the first time Grace had spoken like a mother, protective, fierce, putting Rebecca's needs before her own desire for public validation of their reunion. And for the first time since learning the truth about her identity, Rebecca felt something that might have been the beginning of a familial bond. Diana Blackwood sat in a federal holding cell, watching news coverage of the case that had dominated her life for 20 years. The reunion between Rebecca and her biological parents was being covered like a fairy tale. The stolen child returning home, the grieving parents finally finding peace, justice served after decades of waiting. But Diana knew the reality was more complicated than the news stories suggested. She'd seen the pain in Rebecca's eyes when they said goodbye, had heard the love and confusion in her voice when she'd promised to visit. The reunion with Grace and Marcus would be emotional and meaningful, but it wouldn't erase 20 years of different experiences, different relationships, different ways of understanding the world. Diana's lawyer, a public defender named Tom Richardson, had been trying to prepare her for what was coming. Federal kidnapping charges carried a potential life sentence, though plea negotiations might reduce that to 15 or 20 years. At 51, Diana was looking at spending the rest of her productive life in prison. The prosecutor is under enormous pressure, Richardson explained during their meeting. This case has national attention, and the public wants to see justice served. They're not likely to be generous with plea offers. Diana understood. She'd destroyed multiple lives with her crime, had caused 20 years of suffering for Grace and Marcus, had built Rebecca's entire identity on a foundation of lies. The legal system demanded accountability, and she was prepared to face whatever consequences came. But what haunted her wasn't the prospect of prison. It was the knowledge that she'd lost Rebecca forever, not to death or distance, but to the truth of what she'd done. The young woman she'd raised and loved was now faced with an impossible choice between the family that had raised her and the family she'd been stolen from. And Diana's crime had created that terrible dilemma. On the television in the corner of the holding cell, a news anchor was discussing the psychological impact of long-term abduction cases. Experts say that victims who discover their true identity as adults often struggle with questions of loyalty and belonging. The reporter said, they may feel caught between two families, uncertain of where they truly belong. Diana turned off the television. She didn't need experts to tell her what Rebecca was going through. She could see it in her daughter's eyes, could hear it in her voice. The child she'd raised to be confident and strong was now questioning everything she'd ever believed about herself. 6 months later, Rebecca, who had legally reclaimed her birth name of Isabella Rodriguez but still used Rebecca in her personal life, stood in a courthouse in Denver preparing to deliver a victim impact statement at Diana Blackwood's sentencing hearing. The past half year had been a whirlwind of therapy, media interviews and careful relationship building with Grace and Marcus. Isabella had spent weeks in therapy with both her biological parents, working through the complex emotions of their reunion. She'd also maintained regular contact with Diana, visiting her in jail despite the pain it caused Grace and Marcus. The relationship with her biological parents was developing slowly but genuinely. Isabella had spent Christmas with Grace and Marcus, had met her half-siblings, had begun to build connections with the family she'd been stolen from, but she'd also insisted on maintaining ties to Diana's family, particularly Diana's sister Carmen, who had become like an aunt to Isabella over the years. It was a delicate balance that required constant negotiation and tremendous emotional maturity from everyone involved. But gradually, they were creating something that resembled a functional extended family, built around love and forgiveness rather than traditional blood relationships. Now, as Isabella prepared to speak at Diana's sentencing, she faced the most difficult moment of the entire ordeal. She would have to publicly articulate her feelings about the woman who had kidnapped her, but also raised her, who had committed an unforgivable crime but had also provided 20 years of genuine love and care. Diana sat at the defendant's table, looking older and more fragile than Isabella remembered. She'd pleaded guilty to federal kidnapping charges in exchange for a recommended sentence of 15 years. At 51, she would likely serve at least 12 years before being eligible for parole. Isabella approached the podium, her prepared statement in her hands. She looked out at the packed courtroom, Grace and Marcus in the front row, reporters and court watchers filling the gallery, Diana's sister Carmen crying quietly in the back. "Your Honor," Isabella began, her voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. "My name is Isabella Rodriguez, though for 20 years I knew myself as Rebecca Blackwood. Diana Blackwood kidnapped me as an infant, and in doing so, she committed a terrible crime that caused immeasurable suffering to my biological parents and to me. But she also raised me with love. She attended every school play, helped with every homework assignment, celebrated every birthday and milestone. She taught me to be strong, independent, and compassionate. The woman who kidnapped me also became my mother in every way that mattered, except the most fundamental one. I'm not here to ask for leniency for Diana. Her crime was inexcusable, and justice demands accountability. But I am here to say that she is not a monster. She is a broken woman who made a terrible choice out of desperation and pain. And while I can never forgive what she took from my biological parents, I can acknowledge what she gave to me. I have two mothers now, Grace Rodriguez, who gave birth to me and never stopped searching for me, and Diana Blackwood, who raised me and loved me despite the terrible circumstances that brought us together. Learning to love them both, while acknowledging the pain that love causes, has been the hardest thing I've ever done. I ask this court to remember that every crime has multiple victims, and that sometimes those victims include people who also received unexpected gifts from the perpetrator. Diana stole 20 years from Grace and Marcus Rodriguez, but she also gave me a childhood filled with love, support, and opportunity. Justice requires that she be punished for her crime, but mercy requires that we acknowledge the complexity of what happened here and the genuine love that existed alongside the terrible wrong she committed. Isabella folded her statement and looked directly at Diana, who was crying openly at the defendant's table. "I love you," Isabella said quietly, her words carrying across the silent courtroom. "I will always love you, but I also love the parents you stole me from, and I can never pretend that what you did was okay." Diana nodded, mouthing, "I love you too," through her tears. Judge Patricia Hawkins sentenced Diana to 15 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after 12 years. It was a sentence that satisfied no one completely but reflected the complex reality of a case that defied easy categorization. As the court session ended, Isabella found herself caught between her two families, Grace and Marcus on one side, Carmen on the other. She hugged them all, these people who loved her despite the complicated circumstances that had brought them together. "Are you okay?" Grace asked, studying Isabella's face with the protective intensity that had developed over the past 6 months. "I think so," Isabella said. "It's going to take time, but I think we're all going to be okay." And for the first time since discovering the truth about her identity, Isabella believed that might actually be true. The path forward would be complicated, marked by continued therapy and careful relationship management, and the ongoing challenge of loving multiple families simultaneously. But it was a path they would walk together, bound by love that had survived kidnapping, deception, and the revelation of devastating truth. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions about Isabella's future plans, about her relationship with Diana, about her feelings toward her biological parents. Isabella ignored them all, walking between Grace and Marcus toward a car that would take them to a quiet restaurant where they could process the day's events as a family. The stolen child had found her way home, but home, she had learned, was not a place but a collection of people who loved her unconditionally. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, home could be big enough to include everyone who mattered, even when their presence together created pain as well as joy. The case of Isabella Rodriguez would be studied for years to come, by law enforcement agencies improving their abduction response protocols, by psychologists examining the impact of long-term identity deception, by legal scholars debating the intersection of justice and mercy in complex criminal cases. But for Isabella herself, the case was simply the beginning of a new life built on truth instead of lies, complicated love instead of simple answers, and the radical hope that families could be created and recreated through forgiveness, understanding, and the willingness to love imperfectly but completely. As their car pulled away from the courthouse, Isabella looked back one last time at the building where Diana would begin her journey to prison, where Grace and Marcus had finally found legal closure for their 20-year nightmare, where she had spoken truth that acknowledged both the crime and the love that had defined her existence. The sun was setting over Denver, painting the sky in the same orange and purple hues that had welcomed her home so many times as Rebecca Blackwood. But now she was Isabella Rodriguez again, driving toward a future that honored both her names, both her families, and both the pain and the love that had shaped her into the woman she was becoming. The stolen child was home at last, carrying with her all the contradictions and complexities that love creates when it grows in impossible soil, and somehow that was enough.